Good evening. Welcome back. Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 49. I've entitled the lesson today, The Fifth Kingdom. This is lesson 3 in the Daniel series. Last week, we really looked at everything, all the build up to Daniel actually providing the dream and the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar. And so we're just going to pick right back up there. This time focusing on Daniel as he explains the dream to Nebuchadnezzar as well as the interpretation. So we're back in the city of Babylon with our three friends, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Again, by way of reminder, they were taken captive in really what was the first major deportation by Nebuchadnezzar from the inhabitants of Judah and in particular Jerusalem. Just by way of reminder, Nebuchadnezzar would do this again in 597. That was the second deportation. As we've said before, that was when Ezekiel went into captivity. And then there was the third and final deportation and really the destruction of the temple. And it was just left in absolute ruins with, nothing but the whole hoi polloi, the riffraff left. And that occurred in 586. Again, this was not Nebuchadnezzar's power. This was God's judgment against the nation of Israel because of their sin. Over the last couple of weeks, we saw that in that first deportation, and no doubt others as well, that Nebuchadnezzar took some choice teenagers with the goal of really converting them from being Jewish and having a Jewish mindset and a Jewish worldview and Jewish morals to being fully Babylonian, fully Chaldean. They were indoctrinated. They were assimilated. The goal was to take the best and the brightest and to really make them Chaldean. Just by way of a reminder, if you're in my Sunday school class you're reviewing this, we do have a get-together on March the 4th, 2022. I'll be smoking something. I think Tim's going to be smoking some salmon, so I think we're going to have a lot of great food, and we'll talk about what video we're going to do together. Maybe a Christian debate, or I've got a couple other things in mind. So again, the fifth kingdom. Just by way of a reminder, we are looking at Babylon, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, at its peak under Nebuchadnezzar. You can see their influence is slid even down into Egypt. This was really about the largest the kingdom got, but a massive kingdom. And then just by way of a reminder, we say this almost every time, but the march from Jerusalem to Babylon, 500 miles in a straight line, theologians, scholars tell us that once you factor in trade routes, it could have been twice that. So if you average 3 miles per hour for 15 hours a day, that's 22 to 23 days to make this trip. So it would have been fairly brutal. Again, as we continue on, just by way of a reminder, Daniel, we're thinking about 17 when he went into captivity. Again, Daniel lived over 90. He was a contemporary with Ezekiel. Again, you probably already gathered that as we talked about Ezekiel going into captivity during that second deportation, but also a contemporary with Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, who did not go into captivity. Just by way of a reminder, this is just an overview of the city of Babylon. They believe the river Euphrates was actually moated off all the way around the city. This is the northern fortress, the southern fortress, or palace if you prefer. This is a processional way. We've talked about that in the annual celebration that they had that took them directly to the Edamananki, the platform between heaven and earth that had the temple to Marduk built on the top of it. Again, this was a beautiful place. It was a completely pagan place. Again, this is the Edamananki. That's just the temple to Marduk. And again, that's what we believe Nebuchadnezzar built. We believe that the Edamananki itself he found, and we'll talk briefly about that in a moment. But an absolutely beautiful city, a super fortified city, 3 walls, they tell us, history tells us, with the walls being 40 foot tall. Again, the city itself, about 200 square miles, so about the size of Chicago, and the best estimate of inhabitants was about 200,000. A massive city, a very pagan city, a very powerful city. This is the Neo-Babylonian Empire at its peak. This is the Ishtar Gate going into the city. So if you're trying to locate that, that would be here. That's the Ishtar Gate. Again, just to give you some scale, those are 2 people right there. A massive gate. It was reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. It's been cleaned up. That is the real Ishtar Gate. Absolutely beautiful, amazing, incredible. Artist rendition of the processional way. We'll take a look at, you see this blue going down about 200 meters worth. We'll take a look at that. This is the Ishtar Gate. This is the Edamananki. Again, this is, you can see them as going down this main way that goes to the Edamananki. This is, again, that Muriel from the processional way. This has been reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum. A mock-up of the Edamananki with the temple to Marduk. Marduk was the patron god of the city on the top of it. And again, what we believe is that Nebuchadnezzar found what is probably the remains of the Tower of Babel, cleaned it up, dressed it up, and put the temple to Marduk on the top of it. Part of the inscription, converted to English, reads this: the Edamananki Ziggurat Babylon, that's the Ziggurat of Babylon, the tower, the eternal house, I have completed its magnificence. Now again, he didn't build it, he completed it. The most ancient monument of Babylon, indeed it was. I built and finished it. And again, what we think he means is he put the top on it. I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to heaven, made doors for the gates, and covered it with bitumen and bricks. That should seem very similar if you've read in Genesis about the Tower of Babel. And so with all that, that really brings us now to our lesson and where we left off last week. So the king had a dream, and he could not remember the dream. He called for, remember I made the joke, his dream team, his brain trust, everybody who might be able to interpret a dream, everyone who might be able to give its interpretation upon hearing it. He ushered into his presence the leading sorcerers, the leading magicians, the leading Chaldeans. And he told them he wanted them, he was afraid. This dream had brought him great fear, but he really couldn't quite remember it. That's our best idea from the text. And so he tells them to tell him the dream and the interpretation. There's three back and forths with the Chaldeans and the soothsayers and the magicians saying, we can't do this, this can't be done, nobody's ever asked this. And ultimately Nebuchadnezzar becomes furious and orders that all the wise men of Babylon are to be killed. Now this includes Daniel and his friends. Although they were not there at the time, they were probably just completed the 3-year training program in chapter 1 or nearing its completion, so they're probably like under instruction. But ultimately, they are wise men, and they're going to be put to death. So the decree goes out from the king. Arioch is the guy who's going around killing people, and ultimately he runs into Daniel. Daniel has a conversation with this guy who's rounding people up to kill them about why is the king doing this in haste. Arioch explains it, rather shocking, but again, we see the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He, like rivers of water, he turns it whithersoever he will. And then Daniel goes into the king and he requests extra time. Now, if you remember, that was the one thing the king was not giving anybody. The king accused them of lying to him. He accused them of forming a cabal against him. He accused them of trying to get more time so they could just blow over. But Daniel goes in, and for whatever reason, because God is sovereign and on his throne, Daniel gets more time, what nobody else could get, from Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel leaves that interaction, having told the king that he will tell him his interpretation and dream, although he has no idea what it is. And he goes home and shares that with his 3 friends. He encourages them to pray, and ultimately they pray, have a season of prayer, then apparently they fall asleep or go to sleep. But ultimately in a night vision, God reveals this to Daniel. Daniel gets up, and Daniel goes after a praise and worship session with his friends of how great God is. He goes to Arioch to get an audience with the king, and ultimately he comes into the king. And he tells the king, and Arioch introduces him. And so Daniel is ready to expose the dream and the interpretation to the king. The king reiterates to make sure there's no confusion here. You're able to tell me the dream and the interpretation. So Nebuchadnezzar's really being clear. You got to tell me both. Are you ready to do this? And then we hit verse 27. And this is amazing to me. And Daniel answered the king and said, no. First word out of his mouth. It's lucky that Arioch didn't just pull the sword and stick him. No. But what he was going to say is what the Chaldeans had already told Nebuchadnezzar. No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in your bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. So Daniel says, yes, I'm going to do it, but it's not about me. And I didn't get this because I'm some kind of super person. God wants you to know what the dream is. And so that's where we left off last week, and that's where we'll start this week. Immediately, Daniel begins to unpack the dream. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces, and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Verse 36a, this was the dream. Now we don't know exactly what Nebuchadnezzar saw, but because Daniel said, you are the head of gold, we might imagine that even the face of that image looked like Nebuchadnezzar. And so you can see it had chest and arms of silver. It had a midsection and thighs of bronze. It had legs, lower legs of iron, and then its feet were iron and partly tile or partly hardened clay. And again, this is what he said, and now let's just kind of walk through the verses together. So verse 31, and look how he said it. This is what you saw. It's almost like Daniel was looking through Nebuchadnezzar's eyes and seeing exactly what Nebuchadnezzar saw and feeling exactly what Nebuchadnezzar felt. So Daniel said this was a great image. The idea of that Aramaic word is huge, massive, large. This was a massive image. Notice this massive image, again, was frightening. It was mighty. It was exceeding brightness. It stood before you, and its appearance was frightening or dreadful or terrible or fearful. Again, we should get in our mind, it was very bright, it was very massive, it was overpowering, and indeed it was even frightening. And then in 32 and 33, we have really a description of the primary parts: head of gold, chest of arms of silver, middle and thighs bronze, legs made of iron, with the feet of iron and partly tiled clay. And so, as you imagine this, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't say a word. And what you can imagine is that as Daniel is walking Nebuchadnezzar through this dream, it's clicking. He's seeing it afresh. He's going, yes, that is it. Daniel is right. That is exactly what it was. And the fear that it brought the first time, I remember now. I remember how I feared when I saw this thing. And then Daniel goes on. Verse 34, and as you looked at this massive image, a stone was cut out by no human hand. So again, as he's looking at this image, there seems to be over here somewhere in it a stone, and the stone gets cut out, and then it's apparently hurled at this massive image. So picture a small stone. I think that's the idea. I couldn't help but think of David as he took down Goliath. But picture this small stone, and it strikes the image on its feet of iron and tiled clay, and it breaks them in pieces. Okay, fair enough. So it breaks them in pieces. The stone cut without hands, thrown or hurled, hits the feet and breaks the feet in pieces, almost like they're just shattered, like converted to just shards almost instantly. Verse 35. So you're thinking, okay, the feet explode. They're this hard material with chyle. They're very easy to break. Verse 35, then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all together broken in pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them all away so that not a trace could be found. So we don't know if the stone exploded the feet and everything collapsed and blew into little tiny shards that the wind blew away, or if the shock from the stone that exploded the feet exploded the whole statue. But here's the point. The stone, cut out with no hands, hurled at the image, hit the feet, and the whole thing exploded. But then look at the language. The stone, and let's go back a little bit. Oh, sorry about that. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So we go from image, stone, shatters into little tiny pieces, wind carries it, and then the stone, you can imagine, is sitting there, and the stone starts growing into a big mountain. And then the mountain covers the earth. Now, I could not help but think about Psalm 1 as I thought about this imagery, as I thought about this massive, frightening statue being converted to shads so small that the wind just carried them away. It reminded me of Psalm 1. Blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. For his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree that's planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and all that he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so. They are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. This is what Nebuchadnezzar saw. This was the dream. So says Daniel. No doubt it was, because it struck a chord with the king, and he did not say a word, at least not recorded here. He was probably utterly shocked and confounded that Daniel had told him what every Chaldean and every wise man, including Daniel, told him no human being could tell you. If you remember, Daniel 2, verses 10 and 11, as the exchange goes, the third time the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." Oh, and one other person, Daniel, because the living God revealed it to him. You can imagine Nebuchadnezzar's absolutely floored. This is the dream. Verse 36a. Moving on, 36 all the way to 43. So this was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. There it is. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with the soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Now, as you hit verse 36, this is the dream. And then Daniel says, now we will tell the king the interpretation. Now, there's two options. Either Daniel's referring to his three friends, or he's referring to we being me and God. I don't think the latter. I don't think Daniel would speak that way. I think he would just say God's going to tell you if he's involving God. I think he's involving his three friends because it was through the praying and petition of his three friends along with him that God revealed this. And so I think what he's telling him is that we, me and my three friends, will now give you the interpretation that Yahweh gave us. Now, I want to say something here, and if you were in the class, if you saw your note handout sheet, verse 36 is extremely important and will help us immensely not to go astray. When Daniel says, under divine inspiration, speaking for God, being recorded in the scriptures, this is the dream, it was. Now we will give the king the interpretation. That is the interpretation. In verse 45, Daniel goes on to say the dream is certain and its interpretation sure. I would give us one caution. When we have a dream recorded by scriptures, this is the dream, so says the prophet, then the prophet gives the interpretation of the dream, we must guard ourselves against over-interpreting. We must guard ourselves against going beyond the interpretation that the prophet under divine inspiration gave. I read books, I listen to sermons, and many run to Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 and start making connections and drawing conclusions. The problem, this dream has a specific purpose. This dream, as explained, has an interpretation. And this dream, as explained, doesn't view the kingdoms in time like the other, as we get to the apocalyptic section of Daniel, beginning in chapter 7. This dream really has the focus not of lining up the kingdoms and pulling out details, but showing all these worldly kingdoms and how the stone will utterly destroy them. That's the focal point of this dream. And when we start over-interpreting, we start missing the focus of the dream and shifting the focus to something that is not the focus. And what we do is actually diminish the real purpose of the dream and its interpretation. So I would caution us as we hit this, we have the dream, that's it. We now have the interpretation. I would say that's it. So let's just walk through it and draw some conclusions. Now, first Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that, hey, you are the most powerful king on the planet. You are the King of Kings. That is because the God of heaven set you up. The God of heaven gave you this kingdom. The God of heaven gave you your power. The God of heaven gave you your might. He gave you your glory. It's not because of something you did. It's because of something He did. The God of heaven has placed you in this preferred place. He's given you this massive kingdom. He's given you this beautiful capital. Like Adam, He has given you dominion. The sovereign of the universe, for reasons known only to Him, chose to build you up, to use you as an instrument. You are the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. Now this means that God is the one who elevated Nebuchadnezzar for His own reasons to accomplish His own will, His own purposes, and His own desire. Now, as you think about the Babylonian Empire, it did reign from 626 to 539, or if you think about just the head of gold, about 605 to 562. Keep in mind these dates are just rough. I butt them up against each other, but kingdoms don't rise and fall typically exactly on the same day. But understand that what Daniel is telling him is you are this, Nebuchadnezzar. Then verse 39a provides a brief, and by brief I mean very brief, explanation of a kingdom that's coming. Verse 39, another kingdom inferior to you shall arise. That's all the ink it gets. All Nebuchadnezzar knows is that there's a kingdom coming after him that's going to be inferior to him. It's the chest and arms of silver, and they represent a kingdom that's going to rise after Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom that's inferior to his kingdom. Now we know by way of extension who the silver represents. This represents the Medo-Persian Empire, again looking at rough dates, 539 to 331. Theologians and historians agree, but beyond that we have nothing else to say. There's very little ink given on this kingdom. Verse 39, another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and that is it. So Nebuchadnezzar, not only are you not going to stay in power forever, but it's actually going to be an inferior kingdom that takes over. To go beyond those points is unwarranted and indeed unnecessary. Verse 39b. So we're just limited ink on these kingdoms. Makes mention of another kingdom, a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the whole earth. Now, again, we see that it's inferior, but let's be honest, it doesn't even say that. We just get it because we went from gold to silver to bronze. We're getting harder and we're getting less valuable. We see that. But the only ink we're really given here is this third kingdom. It will rule over the whole earth. Well, we know exactly who that is. That kingdom represents the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great. If you remember, in his late 20s, Alexander the Great is said to have wept because there were no additional lands to conquer. It is amazing to consider that very limited ink, but the one thing that it does say, this kingdom would rule over the whole earth, and indeed it did. But hopefully you see there's a devaluation, there's a degradation. We're going from superior to less and less, or more and more inferior. We then come to the fourth kingdom. The fourth kingdom gets more ink than any of the other kingdoms. This kingdom is strong as iron because iron breaks in pieces and shatters. This kingdom crushes. This kingdom has the legs of iron, but the feet and toes are partly potter's clay and partly iron. It's divided. There's some firmness, but there's some brittleness. It's very amazing that as you think about this, it's getting more and more brittle as it goes down, and the feet that have to support the whole thing are the most brittle of all. Theologians and historians agree that the legs of iron, and indeed probably the feet as well, because it's just listed as a fourth kingdom, are all the Roman Empire. And again, I give you rough dates just to kind of get this set in your mind. So we look at these, and the only thing we should be drawing is these represent four kingdoms that follow one another, going from Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom to more and more inferior. It is interesting that the Roman Empire, this inferior one, has the greatest longevity. But again, that is what it is. But again, in this image, we've covered about 1,000 years of history. And then we come to the fifth kingdom, what this is really all about. Verse 44. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Now, as we reflect back on verse 34, and then we see verse 44, really 7 things I want to draw out about this fifth kingdom. And there's some overlap here, so forgive me, and maybe you have 8 or 9 points. But again, we'll get them all out. First, this dream will find its fulfillment, point number 1, in the days of those kings. Now, we know particularly it occurred in the days of the fourth kingdom. It was in the days of the Roman Empire that God set up his kingdom. Now that point will develop, but we get it. But notice how the language is. He's not dividing here. He's just saying it's going to be in the days of those kings. And again, just as all of those kings were destroyed by the stone when it hit the statue, now he's just saying God's going to set up a kingdom, and he's going to give us some things of attributes about that kingdom in a moment. In the days of those kings. That's point number 1. Point number 2, it's God who's going to set up the kingdom. These are man's kingdoms. But in verse 35, we saw there was a stone cut without hands. The stone that struck the statue that made the mountain that covered the earth. That's God, according to verse 44, setting up his kingdom. Now, as you think about this, the stone against this massive statue, insignificant, almost irrelevant, massive, huge, beautiful, powerful. That's God's plan. God's plan is to establish his kingdom with the stone. Insignificant, barely noticeable. And then it's going to slowly build into a mountain. And then that mountain is going to cover the earth. You're like, wow, what will that look like? Mark tells us exactly what it looked like. Mark 1:14 and 15. After John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God and saying, the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel. That's the kingdom of the stone. The kingdom is at hand. It happened during the reign of those kings. God established his kingdom. That's point number 2. The kingdom we're talking about is the kingdom that God set up. The third point is the origin. I've already been alluding to it. It's this small stone. It's this little teeny start. It's Jesus going about from city to city there in Israel. It's Jesus choosing 12 to follow him, 12 who will carry on his ministry. As I was reflecting on this, I was reminded of Matthew 21, 42 and 44, as Jesus was interacting with the scribes and Pharisees. He asked them, have you never read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. This is the kingdom of the stone. The stone that the builders rejected, insignificant, unimportant. The stone that became the head of the corner, established by God. The stone that grew into a mountain. The stone of which, having grown into a mountain, covered the entire earth. That's point number 3. The origin of God's kingdom is this seemingly insignificant and inferior stone. Verse 35, this stone that was cut without hands destroyed the statue. Converted it to dust, the wind blew it away, and we see the greatness of earthly kingdoms brought to nothing. God's little stone becomes a kingdom that covers the earth. Wow, the irony of man's kingdoms and God's kingdoms. But the stone cut without hands completely obliterates the statue. That's point number 4. Point number 5, verse 44, this kingdom, the kingdom of the stone, the kingdom of Christ, shall never be destroyed. This is unlike any earthly kingdom. We don't know any earthly kingdom like this that's never been subverted, never been destroyed. I was reminded as I thought about this to teach this lesson, as Jesus had taken his disciples up in the Caesarea Philippi, and he began to ask them, who do men say that I am? And they'd answered some. And then finally, Simon Peter replied in Matthew 16, beginning in verse 16, you are the Christ, the Christos, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Upon the rock of the profession that Jesus is the Christ, God will build his church. The stone cut out that crushed the statue will grow into a mountain. That mountain will cover the earth. The writer of Hebrews expressed our receiving this kingdom this way. Therefore, let us be grateful. Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. Every earthly kingdom has been shaken to its foundations and blown away. And the ones that are here today will one day be shaken to their foundations and blown away. But there'll be one kingdom that stands. It's the kingdom of Christ. It shall never be destroyed. To go with what the writer of Hebrews says, which is God, it'll never be shaken. This brings us to point 6. This kingdom will not pass person to person. It will be not left to other peoples. It will not even pass from one king to the next king. As I reflected on this idea that one people will have it, it's not like these other kingdoms where people live, people die, people take them over, they trade. One king lives, dies, none of that. One people, one king. This kingdom is not changing hands, and it has one king. The psalmist in Psalm 2 asked the question, why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth have set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, against his Christ, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will say the decree, the Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. You see, this kingdom will not be passed person to person or even king to king. That's point number 6. Point number 7, it shall put an end to all other kingdoms. Although it's running simultaneous, right? When it entered the world during the Roman Empire, it ran simultaneously. It's running simultaneously with a number of kingdoms. But yet, one day, it will put down, finally and forever, all kingdoms. Now, this is an amazing prophecy about the coming Messiah's kingdom. When it would come, what it will be like prophetically, and then how it would be that's totally different from every kingdom, in particular, most notable, not being passed along and standing forever. The whole time the world is in turmoil, these kingdoms are diminishing, these kingdoms are degrading, these kingdoms are depreciating, these kingdoms are going one person to another person. The kingdom of Christ is growing, the kingdom of Christ is expanding, the kingdom of Christ is covering the globe, and there's no turnover with the kingdom of Christ. Can you imagine what went through Nebuchadnezzar's head as he heard all of this? Verse 45. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, its interpretation sure or faithful. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods, and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. This dream, the Aramaic word, means true. The interpretation, the Aramaic word, faithful. That's where we're at. Again, to go beyond the interpretation is really to move into an area we'd probably be wise to stay out of. Verse 46, we see that Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face before Daniel. He commands that an offering and incense be made to Daniel. Then in verse 47, Nebuchadnezzar makes what is a very orthodox declaration about Yahweh. If he came down to our church and said this, we would baptize him. We'd bring him into fellowship. I mean, this appears to be a man who's given his life to Christ. He says, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you've been able to reveal this mystery. This is from the lips of a pagan king, but it accurately testifies to our great God. Now at this point, you might think, well, maybe Nebuchadnezzar got saved. Well, as you will see in just one chapter, no, not yet, maybe not. Was he amazed, shocked? Sure, all of those things. Humbled for a little bit? Yeah. But not converted, not yet anyway. Now, one of the Sunday school members last week asked, why would God reveal this dream? Why would he do all of this with the pagan king? He didn't need him. He had Daniel. He had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, number one, this reminds us that God is always revealing himself in marvelous, miraculous, amazing ways to pagan kings, pagan priests, pagan pharaohs, pagan people. Our God is a loving, kind, compassionate God who's always trying to make himself known to lost people. But also we have to see that God is elevating his servant in the eyes of his supervisor, this pagan king. Nebuchadnezzar not only recognizes that God is the God of gods, although he's going to forget that, but he recognizes that Daniel is the one whom the King of Kings speaks through. He has elevated his servant to a place that no one else has, God's mouthpiece. And then I would say thirdly, Daniel and his friends are comforted because they are reminded that the day is coming, the kingdom of the stone. This kingdom will put down all other kingdoms. This kingdom will grow into a large mountain. This kingdom will cover the earth. No one will thwart this kingdom. No one will take this kingdom. This kingdom will not be turned over and left to others. This kingdom will stand eternally forever with its one true king. The lesson from chapter 1, as Nebuchadnezzar hauled off the artifacts from the temple to place them in the temple of either Marduk or Nabu or both, it was that Marduk had won. Nabu, Nebuchadnezzar's God, had won. You see, the real message is, no, Yahweh was on his throne, and everything that happened was working out his plan. He's still in complete control, and everything that's happening is following his plan. Verse 48, then the king promoted Daniel. He gave him high honors and many great gifts. He made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and he made him the chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel had to think of Joseph. I mean, this is a very similar story with a very similar outcome. He had to reflect on Joseph. As you think about Daniel and Joseph, both these men humble, both giving God the glory, both, even though God is using them, they're pointing people to God, and both radically elevated by God. So verse 49, Daniel petitions the king to set up, and the king appoints Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel remains in the king's court. So we talked about the 7 points about the kingdom of the stone. I won't review those again as we talk about points of application or thoughts. I will say this, my wife often says that God can turn things around on a dime. What a turn of events here in Daniel chapter 2. If you use YouVerse and you happen to be a friend with me, you'll see I put this in YouVerse. As chapter 1 begins, we are introduced to Daniel, a young man of nobility, a member of the royal family who becomes a slave. Then in 1:16, we see the slave becomes a student. Then in 1:17, we see the student becomes a seer. Then in 2:48, we see the slave has now become the sovereign over the whole province of Babylon underneath Nebuchadnezzar. And then finally, we see that this slave has also become a supervisor of the wise men. So from slave to student to seer to sovereign over the province to the supervisor of the wise men, he had to be thinking about Joseph. But it does remind me of two things. Number one, as Peter said in 1 Peter 5:6, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you at the proper time. And number two, Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Number two, as you think about thoughts and applications, all kingdoms will ultimately fall to the kingdom of Christ. That includes America. I love my country. I love my country dearly. But we are just pilgrims and sojourners here. We're just passing through. We are looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. In the end, as Dr. Bachman, Vadi Bachman said, even America gets the stone. Number three, it is still amazing to reflect, to consider how the kingdom of God started and where it is now. Unassuming, almost apparently irrelevant. Just one man, the God-man, of course, walking around preaching. He gets 12 to follow him, and they tell people, and the kingdom has indeed covered the earth. We talked about God always working to make himself known. It worked on Nebuchadnezzar. He fell on his face. It's just unfortunate he didn't stay there. It's been said that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But I would remind us, it is the mercy of God when he humbles someone. When he humbles a man or a woman, the way he humbled me when I was saved, the way he humbled Nebuchadnezzar here. Nebuchadnezzar was certain that Nabu or Marduk or a combination of them had won the day. And so in chapter 1, we see him hauling off artifacts out of the temple in Jerusalem. In chapter 2, we see him fearful that he can't remember a dream, and he's irrational, and he's acting crazy and threatening to kill everyone because he's so fearful about this dream he cannot remember. And now we see him on his face. It's God's mercy that humbles a man or a woman. Number 6, the one who oppresses you is not sovereign. God can humble them too. The king's heart indeed is in the hand of the Lord. As rivers of water, he turns it whithersoever he will. And then lastly, hope is never lost. That's the lesson from the book of Daniel. It looked like hope was gone. Hope had left the building. Hope is never lost. I submit unto you Daniel chapter 2. Lord willing, we'll be back in Sunday school next week looking at Daniel chapter 3, looking at the fiery furnace and Nebuchadnezzar's shenanigans once again. Until we meet in class or on YouTube, God bless you.